All right, guess we're live. Hey everybody, I'm RR Virdi, today hosting the new episode of SFF Addicts, with today's episode being The Power of Story, brought to you by them and FanFiAddict. I'm the author of the first binding, and I'm just going to throw it to everybody to introduce themselves as I see on their screen. So introduce yourselves, your works, and I guess I'll start with Sunyi first.
Hi, I'm Sunyi Dean. I wrote The Book Eaters. I'm a multiple award-losing author who lives in the UK. And I have my dog with me, and she's very
Aww.
distracting and cute. Other than that, yeah, you may hear me run off occasionally if my kids are causing fires in the background.
Totally fair. Next, I'm going to kick it to Travis. If you want to take a moment to introduce yourself and what you recently wrote.
Hi, I'm Travis Baldree. I am the author of Legends Lattes and upcoming Bookshops Bonedust. I wish my dog was here because I would be infinitely more interesting, but you're just stuck with me.
JR.
Hi, I'm JR Dawson, or Jen, and I wrote The First Bright Thing, which came out this summer. It was my debut, and I am currently working on my second book for Tor, which is due after this is over. So
No pressure.
Yeah.
Wow. And last, Kaden.
Hey, I'm Kaden. I'm the author of Elegy of a Fragmented Vineyard. Like, you might have seen this little postcard going around, but that's coming out in January. And then I've got a prequel novella coming out after that, and very early stuff.
Awesome. All right. So this whole thing came about with Adrian and I first talking about just the idea of storytelling and how most of us on here have tweeted about different aspects of storytelling. The idea of stories play some kind of theme in our novels. And we just figured with a lot of stuff going on right now with the writing industry, people talking about storytelling across different mediums, everything from actors strikes and artists of all kinds just coming out, like what story means to everybody. And my first question was going to be, as authors of speculative fiction, what do you feel is the importance of storytelling in today's culture? Like, how does it contribute to our understanding of the world, ourselves, or just how we interact with each other? Because it's such an old medium, and it brings people together. And we can just freeform this, whoever wants to go, unless you want me to call on people.
No pressure.
No pressure.
I'll go because I'm going to break the ice. So I've actually been thinking about this an awful lot lately. In fact, it ended up being a large percentage of the second book I wrote, Bookshops Bonedust, because after writing my first book, the act of writing a story and putting some of yourself in it and having other people respond to it, like, really struck me how powerful that was when I didn't know that it was that powerful. And the thing that seems clear to me is that when we write stories and we put our common human experience in them and other people read those stories and recognize that in themselves, it's like one of the most profound ways that we can not be alone, that we recognize that our experience is shared by other people. And especially now, that seems like extremely, extremely potent because we're all, after COVID, when we're all just seeing each other like this on Zooms, there's so little FaceTime, and we're so wrapped up in the way that we communicate digitally. That kind of element of connective tissue that stories provide seems especially profound. And then with the advent of things like AI, where we're looking at people generating AI stories from, pulping up other people's written works and regurgitating them in an effort to entertain us, it feels like that makes it also very clear how that really substantive element of story is missing and how important it is to me that it stays there, that human connection. Because if there's nobody on the other end of the line, it's like having a phone call with a robot. Like, who am I talking to? Does this conversation have any meaning? They might say something that sounds human, but if there's no person behind it, how awful is that?
Absolutely. It's something that was definitely central to my story as well, the first binding. I have a huge love affair with just the idea and history of storytelling itself and the interaction. And I've always thought that storytelling was a love language that we all share. Because anyone who's followed me on Twitter, and some of you know, because we've talked about this, my whole theme is the idea that historically there's been shared tropes and storytelling techniques and historical arcs that certain characters, and we have the idea of the hero's journey that people have done throughout culture. Certain just archetypes permeate the world. and they've always thought it was kind of like food, that there is a love language in telling stories, even similar stories, because we love them. And that's something that unites us. And it was definitely an MO and why I wrote what I wrote. And I just love that what Travis was saying, after everything with COVID, we're seeing just how much this medium means to people, but as well as what he brought up, that how much the people behind it mean to each other, both from the reader interactions with then the author. Like, people want those parasocial relationships because they make them feel valued in addition to the work itself. Like, people love talking to you. I've seen that on Twitter with every one of the authors here. People love that just engagement. You can make somebody's day just taking a moment to react to the fact that they engaged in like your work.
Yeah, I'll go next, I guess, if no one else is jumping to it. Weirdly, I've been reading this non-fiction book, which I actually have next to me because it's next to my bed, and it's called Sapiens. And it's Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, and it's about how humans became the dominant species on the planet and all the things that we've done. And one of the things, that the point where he kind of marks a turning point for the human species is when we learned to tell stories, because that's when humans learned to not only create a society that we could all buy into and a motivation we could all share, but it's like a technology that allows us to envision a future and shape a world around it. I thought that was really, really interesting, like, because it's a very, you know, social, sciencey kind of book otherwise. But there's a lot there about the power of stories and how they, for better or worse, have made us top of the food chain.
Wow.
JR, you're muted. I think.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
Of course. One thing that I've seen this summer, or that I've been thinking about, is it's a little more micro. Like, we've talked about like the big stuff, and this is a little more internal or more inside the house. When I was writing First Bright Thing, one of the reasons why I wanted to write it is because I needed to take back my own narrative. And I think that when we can put ourselves as, you know, as the forefront, or put our story as the one we're going to share, not only does that empower us, but also it's kind of just like a little message, like through a crack in the wall, you know, like this, hey, you're not alone. You're not the only person who's gone through this or thought this or felt like this. And that, I think, is the reason why I seek out stories and why I share my stories, and don't just keep them to myself, because they make me feel better. And they but then I'm able to start a conversation with the audience on a personal level.
Yeah, I love how you're saying, like, I feel like these stories give that connection between author and reader. Like how Travis was saying with COVID, this is something that we all experience together. And when I was writing my book, so my wife is from Russia, and during this time was a lot of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and we were going through her immigration process. So I wrote these into my characters, kind of, you know, just showing my hatred for war and what it is like for a character to immigrate. It's a way for me to put out my thoughts, my feelings, so that in the hopes that someone might pick that up and relate to that, building that connection. And I think one of like the great things about history and fiction together is that history has so many great occurrences and stories, if you were, but we read them as events. And the thing with stories is that as authors, we're able to construct these events with much more emotion, putting those who read them in there, as if we were putting someone in a simulation to experience these ideas that we want them to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I definitely think, how does it go? There's that adage of writing is the easiest thing in the world. You just sit down and bleed. That one way or another, we all put something that we either want to see or have a reaction to, or want to have an emotional catharsis with into our work, whether it's intentional or not. Something's going to come through that. And we see that with readers a lot of times, where I forget what the term is, but they'll pick up on connections that we intentionally put in. And I think it's apophenia, where they'll find connections that we never meant to have. It's hard to prove that you know that's what that story is, but we also don't get to necessarily take that away from a reader if that's what they get out of that and that's the experience that they have. Cool.
That's something I've always really loved about storytelling in fiction, and I write for theater too, and grew up in the theater, and I think that in any sort of communication with an audience, you've got this really cool conversation that happens where people will bring in their own selves, like you were saying, like, and see all of these things, and then it makes the work deeper, and it gives it like this kind of magical life where it's getting bigger than just us writing it by ourselves. Like it's becoming this massive dialogue, which is really cool.
One thing I think
Yeah.
is interesting is that it seems really clear to me that as writers, we often very unintentionally add things to stories. It's not something that we consciously do. I'm like, I have my plan of what I want to put in here, but I look back and discover, oh, and sometimes not until someone's pointed out to me, wow, that actually is a thing that I think or believe or have felt, and that it leaked in and I had no idea whatsoever. It's like an opportunity to express things that are kind of under the surface in ourselves that we just don't consciously recognize. And so even as the author of something, you can look back after you've told a story and realize something that you hadn't realized before you started, which is pretty cool.
No, absolutely. It, just like JR was saying, this is all a dialogue no matter what with readers. They're always going to be invested beyond just the reading of the work. There's going to be an extra conversation. The next thing I wanted to ask, which just picks up exactly off of this, is the more personal aspect for us is we all write within genres of SF and fantasy, spec fic and gothic fantasy, whatever you want to call them, but they're under the speculative elements. What exactly like drew us specifically and you all to the unique storytelling styles that you chose? And then what opportunities do you think they have? Even if it comes in retrospect, maybe you didn't go into it with that, but what do you think the way you write and what you choose to write allows you to do certain things?
Speculative fiction for me is just, it's about taking the gates off the yard, because it is defined by those elements. Like you can write anything in spec fic. You can write a romance, you can write a crime drama, you can write a thriller, you can write, an adventure story. It's just, it has that speculative element, so that it has more freedom for me than any other genre, that I could write a wide range of structures or narratives or story types and still be speculative fiction, and it can explore all the same issues from literary through to pulp. It just has that extra bit to it, that extra, for me, the icing on the cake. There's always icing.
No, that makes perfect sense. And it's like there's a beautiful history of that. Like I always liken it to, because for those who don't know, I started with urban fantasy as my break-in into SFF. And there's a history of that coming from the original thriller noir detective genre. But then you usually incorporate some aspects of fantastical elements and the urban occult horror into that. And SFF allows you, like you were saying, you just sort of get to blend other genres that you usually, they might stand alone as themselves. Like thrillers have a lot of regimented rules, but urban fantasy is a fantastical playground for that. And then if you take it to the sci-fi aspect, that's how you get a cyberpunk. It's sort of the same themes that the noir detective novels used to do, just with an SF milieu inserted instead.
When I was younger, I was really drawn to... Oh, no, go ahead. Do you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Travis. It's all good.
When I was younger, I was really drawn to fantasy and sci-fi and spec fic in general, because it was all of these amazing things that I was not going to get to experience, but desperately wanted to. I wanted to go through the wardrobe. I wanted to see the dragons. I wanted all of those things. And as I get older, largely I still do. But one of the things that I've discovered that I really like about speculative fiction, especially if it has a very strong like human element to it, is that it reminds me that all of the boring everyday troubles that I have and the things that I experience are worthy of consideration, that they matter. If you take a very common human experience and you add a little fairy dust to it, it's like, it just reminds us that this is not totally mundane. This is something that we're all going to experience, and it is worthy of our attention, and it's worthy of being special. And I really appreciate that, instead of just reading books about, sad divorced people, I can read about sad divorced people who also ride griffins or something. And all of a sudden it's, that's a lot more relatable to me. I don't know.
Well, I think that's one reason why I love the Legends and Lattes world, is that there is so much stress put like importance put on these it could be insignificant things, but they're not insignificant. Like, oh my gosh, we have to do this thing for the business or else. And it's like a thing that you would do at a job, but it's given so much love and care. It's just very human. Whether they're, an orc and a succubus. um I like to use speculative fiction as an extended metaphor to try to explain something that is intangible with a tangible thing. And this is something that I'm running into with the second book is the second book is about death. And death is it's a tangible thing, as in like it is a thing that happens physically, but like the feelings of grief and the feelings of hope and feelings of saying goodbye, like all of these things are such big like things that we don't necessarily have like a physical description for. So I think that spec-fic gives us this chance to say, okay, well, it's like if blah 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 kind of thing. And so what if all of us had something really special inside of us that was this artistic talent, or was a really good hug, or we always got the fresh batch of popcorn and that was like a real thing. Like, what would that look like, and what would how would that empower people to see their inner power on the outside? And I think that in a larger discussion, this summer I got to be on a panel with Jenna Rose Nethercott where we were talking about magical realism and how there's an empowerment for marginalized voices that may not have been able to be heard, hundreds of years ago, or 15 years ago or yesterday. And so magical realism is this really cool thing that you can do with spec-fic in order to talk about oppression and rebellion and uprising and yeah.
And I think that's one of the great things is that we're not bound by what is in the world itself. I can go read a book about colonization, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about Native Americans. It can be about the civilization of people that I can draw that conclusion for myself. And I think a lot of us initially started reading younger fantasy just because, oh, cool, dragons and like swords and magic. But it becomes so much more of that. I really like how Travis said that it is a specific experience. Like I remember most vividly reading The Wise Man's Fear and feeling so impressed that it felt like an experience. It felt like a journey that I was going through. And I think that that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to grab our reader's hand and say, like, let me put you in this world where you might see this magical creature. You might see some scholar going and talking about this, and it might not mean exactly what it means. It gives us the opportunity to put symbolism in it and teach much more complex lessons in a way that is comfortable to us. If I were to go and write, a Western that's historically accurate, I'd be much more limited because I don't know anything about that. But it gives me a chance to feel free in a world that I want to, teaching what I think is important, giving the experiences and stories that I want to be heard.
One thing that I think is really cool is that we're seeing a lot of spec-fic that is coming from, like Kaden, you were talking about, like Native American, like we're seeing like indigenous voices. We're seeing more, we're seeing fantasies that aren't the Western majority. Like we aren't just seeing a bunch of Game of Thrones anymore. Like we're I feel like our genre is really cool in that it isn't just like cis straight white Western dudes anymore. Like we're being able to expand and share by saying, hey, I'm not going to adhere to what, you know, the majority Western, etc. It's I'm going to do my thing and I'm going to put that out there, and then people are picking up and reading it, and we're getting a much more inclusive perspective of the world.
And I think it like gives people a chance to see into it. Like one of the books that I was so excited for this year was Sons of Darkness, because I knew it was a rich Indian fantasy, and because of that, I got to learn a little more about you know, the lore of that, the Mahabharata, and what that means to those people. This is something I'd never experienced outside of it unless I went and decided to read a history book or, you know, the ancient epic itself. And I mean, there's so many books like that that just give us a glimpse into another culture, whether that be, you know, within the States, with outside of the States, or just wherever we are. It gives us a glimpse into someone else's life and their feelings that they're experiencing.
And this ties really wonderfully into the next question I had, which gets into both the societal and individual importance that stories have or take on within people, from personal memory to collective, because some books or movies or whatever IPs you want form these larger identities and these movements that resonate with the time and place. And I wanted to bring up, like, why do you think some of that is? And then if everyone's willing to share maybe one or a few pieces that, you know, resonated with them, that had that same effect, whether it's a novel, a movie, some kind of piece of art that or story that just connected with you and left an impression, and why.
I guess going back, I know I referenced it once, but like I've been thinking about that Sapiens book a lot lately, and how basically the other animals can use language to communicate, but humans are the only ones who use language to tell stories that we know of. And when we create the stories, it does it can change your world, and it can change what you think is possible. So, you know, you're talking about stories that have an effect. I think one that was a big impact on me, weirdly, was Star Trek when I was a little kid, because I grew up very kind of conservative, sheltered, religious, and all this stuff. And Star Trek is actually a very progressive world, and it's very inclusive, and it's a sort of semi-utopian. They've got their issues, but the semi-utopian future, broadly hopeful. And I think just being able to see something like that, which doesn't yet exist, and to know that there are other people who've seen that show and who have those same ideas. And I think, you know, when you're growing up and you're kind of surrounded by more cynical people, and they talk about like, oh, you know, human society can never be better than it is, what would that even look like? And you think, well, it looked like Star Trek, honestly. Like post-scarcity society where we don't have money, sign me up.
For me, I guess I have two IPs that stuck with me throughout my life. One is Forrest Gump. It's probably one of the few movies that actually can make me cry. But it was the first time I saw a framed narrative outside of what I'm familiar with, which Kaden brought up, which is Mahabharata, which is a South Asian epic. And my parents introduced that because it's like a show, or the story's been remade throughout South Asia like a gazillion times. It's one of the most popular IPs, obviously. So in the 90s, they have a version in 2000, late 2000s. And growing up, it's all about everyone's story within this epic. So there's nesting stories throughout it, and you see what's going on with other people between different timelines. And Forrest Gump was the first time I saw that, where it's not just him telling his story. You see what happens to Lieutenant Dan after Vietnam, the effects of after he loses Bubba, and how his personal story resonated with Forrest, and he starts the shrimping company. And it was just really beautiful for me at this time when I was already engaged with SFF, like Xena and Beastmaster, to see a movie where it sort of dialed all this down. This guy is living this almost larger than life, but still finds time to humanize everybody else that he's interacting with through his lens. And then to sort of do the reverse of that, it's a very personal, character-centric novel, and it's The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, who's a Brazilian author, and it touches back to some of the stuff we've talked about earlier. It's a story of adventure about a young Andalusian shepherd boy who goes to follow his dream. And Paulo put a lot of himself into this novel because he'd been a struggling novelist for a long time, and he just couldn't get anywhere, couldn't get a break. So he wrote a book about, I guess, a boy following his dreams and finally achieving it. And it gets into magical realism, and it's very surreal. And ironically, and this is part of why the novel resonated with me so much, this became his breakout book. Like, it sold like gazillions, like tens and tens of millions of copies. Celebrities and presidents have endorsed it. and the idea of him following his dream, manifesting into that novel, then brought about that reality for him. And I just thought the idea of that story behind him that led to that story, and then the story that came out of it that changed his life, was just extremely powerful and beautiful for a book to have that kind of effect.
That's much smarter answer than mine. I'm very
No,
impressed.
no.
So I've always been a big fan of Terry Pratchett, and
Oh,
and in some ways, honestly, Terry Pratchett, and I didn't think about it till now, reminds me a little bit of Star Trek, because he uses fantasy to talk about like a societal idea or a construct or something basically very human. I think Star Trek was always, it used the future as a lens to talk about like the present and the kind of things that we contend with now. And I think Terry Pratchett did very similar things. They had like a slightly different focus, but when I first read it when I was younger, I didn't really get any of this. I just enjoyed reading Mort because it was about Death's assistance, and the characters were great, and Terry is funny. But he's also, you know, as I grew older, I just realized how much he cared about people, and how much that manifested through all of those books. That they're ultimately about people and the way they interact and the way that the society functions and develops, and it uses fantasy to talk about that, and it's simultaneously entertaining and illuminating. And I honestly think Terry Pratchett should get way more credit than he does for everything that he did.
So both of mine that came to mind were musicals, because
That's
I'm a
great.
theater nerd, I guess. So, I mean, musicals are a type of spec fic where, you know, people don't break. I mean, I break out into song, but I'm weird. So, but like normally people don't break out into song. And I think that the first one that really hit me, and this is not a good answer, but I went to see Rent when I was 12. And Rent by Jonathan Larson is it's an imperfect piece of art. But I was growing up in Nebraska with a super conservative family. I was, you know, hitting 7th grade, trying to figure out who I was, and in the first like 5 minutes of the play, which my mom didn't know what it was about, and afterwards she was like, "Don't tell your father what this was." About 5 minutes into the play, there's a part that says, "I'm sorry, she's a lesbian," and I was like, "Oh, what's that?" And this was the first time that I was seeing queer folk on stage, and the realization of what it meant to be queer, and seeing the found family, and that like gave me some sort of vocabulary and some sort of understanding of myself and of the world that I was looking at. The other one is, oh God, it's another not good one. 1776 is a musical about the problematic founding fathers, and I was in a production of it here in Omaha where it was all femme actors. So this was back in like 2017 before the Broadway version, which I didn't get to see and I'm super sad about. But I got cast as Ben Franklin, and I was like 30 and definitely not an old dude. But when I got to go on stage as Ben Franklin, it was the first time in my life where I was able to just go into a room and command some sort of like credibility and respect without feeling weird about it or like self-aware or embarrassed or having to be humble. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's like so much privilege here, and this is really empowering, and what the what? And so it was really cool to see like all femme folks up on stage doing this super masculine musical. And so I think, so I'm saying these two to get to the point that I think that sometimes these stories there's an ice cream truck outside. Sometimes these stories can give us vocabulary about ourselves, and that's really cool.
And
Yeah,
you
I
mentioned
think
Lilo and Stitch, so you know musicals are good.
Lilo
Sorry, go
and
on.
for me, I think it has to be the Chronicles of Narnia, just growing up, it's a very simple story, very fairy tale-esque, but it's something I reread as an adult that I recognized that there's so much purpose here, that C.S. Lewis is directly trying to teach something to the audience. And I thought that was such a beautiful lesson. This is something that we can do as authors. We can take a story and it can be completely entertaining, but it can have so much to it. And it doesn't need to be as complex as that. Or if you look at, Lord of the Rings, there's so much you can learn in there, but it's very rich. And it's one of the reasons I love Neil Gaiman. I loved watching his masterclass because he wants to put each of his stories to have a meaning. There's something there. And this really struck me with the ocean at the end of the lane. If you look at it, it's a very simple story, coming of age, and it's kind of a look back, a nostalgic look back on a man's childhood. And it's one that you could pass by and gain nothing unless you look at it and really let it get into you, let it seep into you. It's the same with Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It's literally just a story about a guy and his son walking along a road at the end of the world. Not much really happens except all of the emotional dialogue and the experiences of the relationships we see there. And it just impacted me so much to recognize that, I can have complex stories as well as complex scenes and simple scenes, but there's always something I can put in there.
And this all ties into something else I want to talk about, and we've sort of touched about in certain aspects with storytelling, the idea that SFF, genre fiction, allows authors to, whether consciously or subconsciously, comment and or tackle political, social, and philosophical issues or problems of the world, or even interpersonal relationships. And how do you use or feel that the speculative elements within fiction allow you to do that, comment on it, and how do you personally view, I suppose, using that to talk about these challenges or even just initiate the discussion?
They create distance. The one that I almost mentioned earlier and didn't, but which I'm glad I saved for now. So Lilo and Stitch is always, to me, a really good example of when I talk to people about how narratives create distance. It's a Disney film. It's about a little girl who's being removed from her family by social services. It's really quite a grim story, but there's aliens and there's Elvis music and there's spaceships and there's little gribbly monsters, and that makes it safe to discuss that family situation, which does happen to kids, which is relevant to kids. And it carries the emotional weight that takes some of the sting away, I suppose. And I think that is a really good use of fiction, and something speculative can be. And I remember, especially when I was a kid, that something I thought speculative fiction is really good at is addressing issues like racism or bigotry or things like that, by putting in context where I guess you don't feel threatened, but you're still exposed to a different point of view. Does that make sense? So you're the issues are being discussed without it kind of setting people off and allowing them to kind of actually think about things and engage in things. And definitely for me, I think that was a factor in changing my mindset on a lot of issues.
No, absolutely, especially with how you brought up racism and prejudice. That's something that specifically I definitely included intentionally in the first binding. Being South Asian and having grown up post 9/11, obviously, the opening to my novel, in fact, is a job interview, intentionally done that way. And many of us have probably heard or seen the examples where, depending on how ethnic of a name you might have on a resume, if you have the exact same qualifications or maybe even a little overqualified as someone with maybe a more accessible name, you're more likely to still get overlooked in job applications versus someone with an easier name. So the opening of my novel sort of addresses that, where my character has to come in the most cocky, confident, overqualified person. And as soon as he, I guess, convinces the barkeeper to perform for him, he immediately deflates and he changes. And the conversation then becomes about the barkeeper. He completely moves and starts asking about his life. And then a few chapters later, we see an analog of someone, a woman who is sort of a nod to the Ramani culture, Romani, who come out of South Asia historically, and prejudice she's facing in a culture that she's in a different country that's very church run, very against foreigners. And it's a narrative that continues through it until we even get back into Ari's past, which is sort of an analog of South Asian culture where it gets even into casteism. And for those who don't know right now, for example, in India, there's a lot of Hindu nationalist fervor going on. My family particularly is Sikh, which is a smaller, different culture. They're not Hindu. And there's been a lot of backlash, unfortunately, at times against Muslim population, not necessarily Buddhists, but there's been some of that, and then Sikhs as well. And SFF, like you said, gave me that place to create this distance about this meta narrative, but within it, these humanizing connections of things that people go through, and they can see it through a fantastical lens and maybe understand how it affects a character, and hopefully walk out understanding how that this is still something that happens in the real world without it being maybe too harsh or aggressively in your face and combative, versus just seeing it in a safer environment to interact with it.
When I really liked what you said with that, like especially talking about your book in it, and one of the things that I put in my book is that there are 6 different religious systems, and initially in the beginning I show how divisive they are, but I think one of the great things that we can do in writing is showing how these people overcome a problem. You know, by the end of the book, a lot of these people that were distant, they see their similarities, and even that there are differences, they see how those are of value to those people. And just putting it in a different lens, I think gives it a lot of power. I, in high school, had to read Things Fall Apart twice, and I was a sophomore. I didn't really care about it at that time because I was a dumb high school kid, and it didn't really click with me. That one's a historical fiction, but when I read Ken Liu's Dandelion Dynasty, which is so much about colonization and the early Americas, it really hits you because you get tied to characters on both sides, and you see what he's trying to say, but it's something that comes to you gradually rather than starting the book and being told this is the lesson you're going to learn. It's something you're given over time.
I think that stories in general, if they're not talking about something, and it doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be something societal. It could be, a personal realization or a personal struggle. If it doesn't have something on its mind, it's almost like a car without an engine. I think that's, for me, what ultimately makes a story go. Beyond that, it's not like that's valueless. I can still have a story that's a distraction, but especially as I get older, I want a story that has something on its mind, because that's my foothold to relate to it and care about it. I'm not using it to pass time at that point. I'm using it to bring into myself and internalize, and that fundamentally adds to me as a person. So that's just what I'm looking for in stories anymore. And I really notice it when it's not there. It was a big realization for me when I was writing that it was something I had to have, because I think my biggest struggle as a writer, and with all the books I tried to write and failed, was that I had all the pieces that go around the story, the events that happen, but I didn't have the engine. We were talking yesterday. I was with Lish McBride at another panel, and I think I said something like, you can have a story about somebody slaying a dragon, but I don't care. That person is the same person before and after they slayed the dragon. It just doesn't matter. A dragon's dead. I'm not going to slay a dragon. What do I care? But if the guy had daddy issues and needed to resolve an issue with his father, and that was why he slayed the dragon, all of a sudden he's a different person after he did it, if it was related in some way. And all of a sudden I care. The dragon died, but the dragon's just part and parcel with the fundamental change to this person, which is what I'm really after. So, I don't know. I think all of those things, in my opinion, are some of the most important elements of story, and that lots of the rest of it is just set dressing.
So I think that one thing, well, I've been thinking, I've been stuck on Narnia. So Kaden brought up Narnia, and at the end of Narnia, I mean, if you haven't read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, spoiler alert, I guess, it's been a while. But at the end of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we've seen these 4 kids go through all of this stuff, and then they fall back through the wardrobe and they're children again. And they and a lot of people I know have been kind of inspired by that moment to, stretch out and write other things. I think Wayward Children is a really good example. And I know that C.S. Lewis continues on with that through the other books. And I read the other day that he did that scene on purpose because it was him trying to explain to civilians what it was like to be a young veteran, that you went out and you did this stuff in war and then you came back. And I think that it's really, really effective. I mean, we kind of see it with Frodo too, in Tolkien. Like, my God, like when I heard that, I was like, well, of course. Oh my God, you know. And Neil Gaiman wrote Ocean at the End of the Lane because his wife at the time asked him to write himself as a novella, just write his soul out on the page, and that's what came out. You can see like his Jewish background, you can see his childhood, like there's just so much stuff going on. And I think that it also like removes from the reader this preconception, prior knowledge, or even prejudice. I had somebody say to me something like, wow, gay people are real people too. I mean, it wasn't exactly that, but it was like, oh wow, your main characters are queer, and wow, they really go through a lot. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's what we've been going through here in Nebraska through all this legislation and stuff. Like, this is a very personal story. But if I wrote like, you know, once upon a time there were two queer folks in Nebraska in 2023, then, you know, like heckles are going to come up and be like, oh, Nebraska, or oh, 2023, I know what this is about, this has an agenda. And so and so to remove that and be like, no, we're just going to talk about what does it feel like to come back for more, or what does it feel like to walk down the street and not feel safe, and not be able to hold your wife's hand. And I think that kind of opens that door to that discussion that we were talking about earlier with the reader.
Yeah, you've got to create empathy, but in a way that gets around people's kind of established issues, I suppose, and contexts.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really bizarre thing that people say, oh, you have an agenda. Like, of course I have an agenda. Who writes a story without an agenda?
Oh God, you guys are like killing it, because this literally feeds like, hey, I don't know how you guys are actually doing it subconsciously, because they literally perfect to the next question. And I'm going to tie in an audience question we just got. But the question I had was, the realm of genre fiction allows all of us to explore possibilities, obviously outside the realm of normal reality. And then how do you balance the idea or need for escapism, which we understand that a lot of SFF still has, along with whatever we want to talk about that we feel is relevant in our story? Whether it be something like sociopolitical issues or the idea of just human-centric things, personal identity. And then a question we got from Andrew Watson, which I'll put up and then read aloud, is I'd be interested to hear who goes into a book with a theme or idea, or if it comes in from the narrative after the fact. And I'll just for once go first, not to put it on anybody else, because I've been doing that a lot. For me, I definitely know, obviously headed by this, is the power of story was a huge thing to me growing up multiculturally, because I'm first generation born here in America. My background is South Asian, and growing up with South Asian stories, I was always aware it was never a monolith or a single culture. It's the birthplace of countless religions and the heart of the Silk Road and storytelling techniques, and is exposed through a lot of them through the equivalent of like South Asian fairy tales and fables, along with the epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata. And as I grew older, reading a lot of Western fiction, I would see how many things from my culture would show up there, but there was sort of a disconnect, or maybe the idea that people just weren't aware. Like the Wheel of Time, the very idea of it is Kali Yuga, which is quite literally the Wheel of Time, this entire reincarnation cycle. And then Avatar, The Last Airbender, which I love to death, but the word is Avatar, and it's essentially the idea of a reincarnation of like a divine spirit, usually a god or demigod. And a lot of Western fiction would take ideas and tropes that have roots in older cultures, but I never saw the older cultures getting to do that, as JR talked about. And I'm like, oh, I get to finally tell a story about the nature of storytelling and sort of show how all these historical tropes would look like in the lens of an older culture that also had them. Because for people who don't know, the two epics I brought up, Ramayana and Mahabharata, are very similar to the Iliad and the Odyssey, almost beat for beat. And they both popped up out of the exact same time in the world, or give or take about 100 years. These cultures traded with each other, and they're both inspired by the Proto-Indo-European cultures, which also inspired the Norse culture. And there's analogs of some of the most famous beats of like slaying a dragon that start around the same time from these three like historical proto-cultures, and they're synonymous with all of fantasy up to today. And it goes for like the temptress and all these different archetypes from the mentor and things that were codified into the hero's journey. And I just never saw that historically done with my culture in the West. And I was like, yeah, I wanted to go in and show this theme of like this unifying love letter to like storytelling's universal. And we've all been like cherry picking for the longest time in the breadth of larger fantasy from like the same tree, if that makes sense. And hopefully answers Andrew's question, at least from my perspective.
No, I think that's a really good perspective. I think a lot of times I have an idea for a book and then I apply something that I want to teach with it. I mean, my most recent work that I'm doing right now that I'm just starting for a new book, it's completely based off of a dream. I had a cool dream and I'm like, oh, this will make a great story. And I sat down, started plotting it out, and I was like, okay, what do I want to teach here? And it kind of formulated into this structure that is both including enjoyable elements that are completely for entertainment, as well as there's a metaphor, there's something to be taught. And in my debut novel, I went in with the same approach. I had, I had an idea for a story, and as I wrote it, I understood, okay, these can mean these things, these can mean these things. But, I was halfway through when, like I said, my wife was going through the immigration process. It's stupid expensive. It's very difficult to go through. And I was mad at that at the time. And I was like, okay, I have a character that I want her to go through it. And I want it to show what she becomes because of it. I want people to see how I feel and how it feels, because we were very fortunate and blessed with the resources we had, the help of family and friends. But what is it like for someone who doesn't have all that? And I don't have a complete understanding of all the people going through those situations, but I want to let their story be heard. And it continued as I finished the book that, I had a general idea what I wanted to work in. And if I had a lesson I wanted to be taught, it didn't mean I need to throw it all out, but I could add a scene, a certain interaction between two characters, just to mention something that has an impact.
Yeah, I think.
So
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, go on.
I was going to say, I think that everyone probably discovers themes to an extent as they write, but at least, and I think this is probably true for lots of people as well, at least for me, I can't really write a story unless I have an idea of what the emotional heart is going to be, or what the overriding emotion is, or sometimes just what the overall idea is. So I guess in relation to Book Eaters, the idea that I was always interested in from the very beginning is how people become bad, starting from good intentions and good methods, just by inches and degrees, and how they become bad people because my protagonist is a terrible person, and there's no excuses made for her for that. And she begins the novel as and the entire book is showing how she got to the point where she's become a monster. And that was the idea that interested me. And there are lots of other themes that come out through it. But I think that's the case for everyone to an extent. Like you do discover some of it, even if you have a very fixed idea of what your book's about.
It's interesting because I was still rooting for Devin the whole time. Like, she's a terrible person, but you still want her to win. So yeah. I think that I start with like images, or like I want this feeling. I like it's these moments between characters, or these really human interactions that kind of becomes the important part of any story if I'm writing it or reading it or watching it. Like, can we talk about Ahsoka for a second? Because I mean, I don't want to give anything away, but this last episode of Ahsoka on Star Wars, it was really good character work. And so it's like those moments that I start with. So for First Bright Thing, I had two moments. I had the feeling of making art, and like it just kind of pouring out of you, and that energy going out into the world. And that became Jo Reed's spark, or her magic power. And then the other one was this feeling of having to say goodbye to everything and somebody else defining you, and kind of like just encapsulating and enveloping you in their narrative. And how do you get out of that? And so from those, came the larger story of, and now it's going to be in a circus, and now it's going to be about this. And like Kaden said, like this book that I'm working on, I was like, well, it's about death, and it's about, you know, like the idea of Orpheus and Eurydice, and it's about how I felt when I lived in Chicago and all this. And as I've been writing it this summer, and we are currently fleeing our state, and packing up our room, as you can see, like we're losing the house and we're moving to Minnesota, 7 hours away, just suddenly. That's definitely come into the book, like the idea of having to, of losing a life, of grief, and all of the different kinds of grief. And it's not just necessarily when somebody passes, but the different sorts of changes that we have to go through in life. So I think that at least for me, it's what I start with, but then what is happening as I'm going through the manuscript. It kind of turns into embarrassingly therapy sessions for me.
I think I have kind of a similar approach. I've discovered that what I basically have to have is I feel like I have to look back in myself and find like an ache, like a point in my past where I had to make a decision, or something fundamental changed about my life, and I didn't know which way it was going to go, and I chose one road or the other. And so for Legends and Lattes, the book is about someone in their 40s who's done a job for decades and then discovers they don't like it anymore, and wonders if they can start a new life or not, which is, that's what I did. I did a job for 20 years. I got into my 40s and I said, I don't like this. Is it too late to do something else? What, you know, it's that sunk cost fallacy, right? I'm like, I've spent this long doing this. Is it even possible to start over? And for me, it was, you know, so Legends and Lattes is about somebody in their 40s who discovers they hate what they do. They quit. They start a new job they've never done before. They move to another city and they discover a whole community of people they never knew existed. So I made video games for 20 years, discovered I hated it, quit, became an audiobook narrator, moved to another city, and discovered a whole community of people who were audiobook narrators that I never knew existed and were really important to me. So that's basically what the book is. So for me, it's like that feeling, which kind of becomes an idea. And then I think theme sort of grows out of that as like tentacles, you know, after the fact.
I'm kind of just staggered you made Legends and Lattes even more wholesome after sharing that story, because I didn't think that was actually possible. But wow, kudos to you. Geez. Now my next question sounds like a lot underwhelming after ending on that note. God damn it, Travis. What I was going to say is, because storytelling doesn't just exist in books, which is how it's known to most of us. Obviously, Travis, you've designed video games and also as an audiobook narrator. And I wanted to incorporate the idea of that. It's such a powerful thing, and we've seen it in different forms of mediums like TV, film, video games, that we all exist and interact with, like you just brought up, JR, referencing Ahsoka. How do these complement or enhance our ability to, I guess, tell stories? Because we can draw from them. They might teach us different things, seeing how a character can be on screen, or different life experiences. You've talked about being in the theater, JR. I actually studied that too. I wanted to be an actor at one point, which is very plainly written into Ari's life that he doesn't ever get to get on stage. That opportunity is stolen from him in his case. But it's still so stuck in his core identity. And just go from there. Like, how do we interact with these, and how do they affect us, and I guess change our ability to tell better, or whatever the stories we want to tell for the audience are?
So I love this. Like my thesis, because I'm a big nerd, my thesis was about how to hit catharsis in different mediums of storytelling.
Ooh, I want to read that. That's
Oh my gosh.
Go ahead, please.
It was so fun. And so what I did in the thesis is I took 3 stories that were musicals, books, and movies. They had been adapted from usually books. One of them was Matilda. Matilda was the 90s movie at the time, the book, and then the musical that's Tim Minchin wrote, and it like exploded, and it's one of my favorite musicals. And so I was talking about where is the catharsis, how do they hit it, you know. And I think that each medium does a different thing. It's like you've got it's like you've got like your content, and what shape is the content, and what is the vase that you have to like build around that content in order to make it hit the most. So one of the projects I was working on a couple of years ago was called When We Go Away, and it was commissioned by the Institute for Holocaust Education. It was 45 minutes for 6th to 7th Gentile, 6th to 7th graders who were mostly Gentile. And I had to take 5 testimonies from 5 different survivors that had ended up in Omaha and kind of weave it into a live performance. And so on opening night, sitting there with the audience when it happened, like you could hear a pin drop, like with the actors, with the direction, with the lights, with the music. Like the music was beautiful. And we had woven all of these Jewish prayers, which if you know anything about Jewish prayers, they're all music, into the actual script. And like it was really powerful. And it was something way bigger than me just typing on a piece of paper. It was the theater was able to be this collaboration of the community, of the actors, of the crew, everybody. And I was thinking about when we were talking about the road earlier, we've got The Last of Us, which is the TV show, and also the video game. And Travis can probably talk more about video games as a medium than I can. But when there's a big difference between watching The Last of Us and being in The Last of Us. And it's as a zombie attack, and as like trying to protect Ellie and all of this, like it's a different way to interact with the story. So I'm a big nerd. I love the differences between the mediums.
Well, I love how you say that with The Last of Us and The Road, because I've always drawn those things together. And I'll ask people what they think about The Last of Us. I haven't played the video game, and I know that there's a lot more depth there. But one of my complaints with the TV show is that I just didn't feel like the connection between Joel and Ellie was that they took that too deep. I thought there were some big jumping points, and I guess that's why I like The Road so much. It's something that we see gradually happen, and it's just the relationship. That's it. And something kind of that we see in The Witcher, if you look at it from that with Ciri and Geralt, that they develop this father-daughter relationship. And I think one of the great things about having so many different adaptations or just completely different stories is that they'll resonate more with others. Some people absolutely love The Last of Us. I thought The Road was better, but that's just my opinion. We're both still probably gaining some similar story and knowledge, but it's impacting us in a similar way. And another thing you look at is Dune. I love both the movie and the story because Frank Herbert writes with such rich storytelling and world building, and there's a lot of symbolism, and I love digging for that, trying to learn something. And that one, I think, on a philosophical side, impacted me a lot more than the movie, which was just a beautiful spectacle, and it created such a great atmosphere with the music and the imagery. And I think that's a cool way to realize that we can experience the stories in different ways. Sometimes our mind might be just set on entertainment. I want to wind down and just gain this. But other times we're going to be a lot more open to gain metaphor, symbolism, and what the purpose is of a story.
There's something I definitely want to comment on too, which sort of ties into this, and then the history of storytelling, which I think is just kind of lovely. But you brought up how many other versions there are of that trope of like the adult figurehead and like the child, like Witcher and Ciri, Last of Us, and then we also have The Mandalorian, and then you can dial it back further. There's actually a Japanese manga called Lone Wolf and Cub, which is the exact same story. And it goes back. Yeah, thank you for getting that, by the way. And it goes back to the same idea of how there's certain universal themes and stories that transcend medium, because manga is a very different format. It's a visual light novel, and they have these thick, dense tomes like The Road. And then we adapt them to video games or a blockbuster Star Wars universe franchise. But these core I guess, human stories that we want to tell, which has been part of what we've all talked about, regardless of the question. It keeps coming back. Those themes always overlap. It's something I've talked about too in mine, where I've got things that are not unique to me at all. They're just universal. But the things I incorporated in the first binding and the rest of the series, as people will see from other mediums, have been things like poetry. Because again, like for the great Indian epic Mahabharata, people don't know that a lot of it was an epic poem first, and it's consisted of mostly couplets with some quatrains. And there's a love letter chapter I have in there where most of it is written all entire couplets. And if you delete the normalized prose, the entire chapter becomes a perfect epic poem in order. And that's just a little secret that some readers have found out, but it's a love letter for me showing storytelling techniques from other structures like poetry. My entire novel, someone figured out, is structured like a theater play because Ari is a performer. So the interludes or present day breaks are called intermissions, but they still advance parts of the romantic subplot because that's actually a Bollywood technique. So for visual screen, and the book's been out for a year, so I can now say this, but there's a romantic subplot catharsis that happens during what's an analog of a Western masquerade, but these two more South Asiatic characters have their romantic catharsis then during a dance number and a song, which is exactly another nod to Bollywood technique. And throughout it, when Ari performs the nesting stories, he's borrowing from techniques that I've seen in video games. If everyone's ever played not Final Fantasy, Resident Evil 4, I believe, the intro to that was shadow puppets and little paper maches, and they were telling a sort of story before the story begins. And Ari actually narrates by using shadow light and firelight to create shadow puppets on the wall while he's telling a story in a tavern. The entire, I guess, system of Tales of Terrain has nods to different mediums and genres. I have things that nod to how Western begins, but it's in a later chapter. And I've always just found that beautiful that all these different forms of mediums can be in conversation with one another, regardless of how they're portrayed and created.
So I guess as the audiobook narrator, I'm going to talk about audio. Honestly, I feel like, audio is the original storytelling medium, spoken word. And in a lot of ways, I think that the written word is an imperfect translation of that. It's always attempting to recreate that. All of the punctuation that we use, the way that we care about the beat of a sentence, like we know it's going to be said out loud. Because effectively what we're doing is we're putting little squiggly marks on a page and trying to use them to reproduce sound in our own minds to approximate what the spoken word would have accomplished. So I love audiobooks, obviously, or I wouldn't do this job, but largely because in some ways I think it's restoring some of what we can't perfectly translate in text. And I think as long as it's done well, it's always additive. You're always bringing something back to a story that it would have liked to have been there to begin with if you're doing it well. So I think audio is incredibly powerful. And obviously it's proliferated now that we all have, space phones in our pockets that can play audio for us no matter where we are at any time of the day, which is a remarkably modern convenience. The audiobook industry has barely existed, but I think it's particularly special because I think it's really elemental. And the fact that we now get to experience things in audio to the degree that we do, that we get to have accomplished storytellers tell us stories in the way that, honestly, they were originally intended to be told, I think is incredible.
So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the power of audiobooks, and like we're talking about how we experience stories in different mediums, and something happened to me that had never happened before with First Bright Thing, which is that I wasn't just writing it, and it wasn't a play that I wrote and then somebody like went and put up on stage and like that was going to be the medium. I was really excited for the audiobook. Like when I was writing it, I was like, oh, this is gonna be good, because like as a playwright, you're like, ooh, there's gonna be voices and stuff. And so I took it very seriously, and I was like, okay, we've got the two people who are playing these parts and blah blah. I thought I was ready. And I barely cried the whole time I was writing the manuscript, and then I had a completely different experience of it being a listener. So I was stuck on a plane heading to LA when the file was sent to me, and I listened to Patria Burchard and Tim Campbell do the the voices, the
They're both
audiobook, and
fabulous people, by the way.
oh my God, they're amazing. And I just sobbed. Like I got halfway through and I was like, I don't know if I could do this. Like I was there was like a chapter that Tim did of one of the perspective characters who's not a very nice dude. And he just like went and oh my God, it's still like I texted him after and I was like, you owe me therapy bills. Like, so it was just this completely different experience to hear it. And I think that it's not just like something that I've written, but like I listened to the audiobook for Jeanette McCurdy, and it was a different, I think, experience than people who read it. She wrote I'm Glad My Mom Died, which is a super, super personal memoir about child abuse in Hollywood and her growing up on Nickelodeon. And it's just a really, really powerful story. And she was the audiobook narrator, and hearing her read it was a different sort of medium than reading it myself. So yeah, audiobooks are awesome. Patria is awesome. Tim's awesome. Everybody's awesome.
And I love how Travis talked about how, this was the original story form. And maybe that's why I enjoy audiobooks so much sometimes, because especially I listen to the whole Wheel of Time, and I've listened to a ton of Brandon Sanderson's books. So when I hear Michael Kramer and Kate Redding reading a story to me, it feels like going back to a good old friend just telling me a story. And just the way that they do different voices really impacts me so much deeper. And that's what I loved about all of Joe Abercrombie's books. Stephen Pacey does such a great deal that it doesn't feel like a person is just reading in a monotone voice, which might be what I experience sometimes while reading. But to have this person acting them out, it's almost like the most loyal adaptation that you could ask for.
It's almost like if you could go to a comedy show and you could just read all the jokes versus having the comedian tell you the jokes. The read jokes are just not going to be as funny, especially if you yourself are not good at telling jokes.
That goes back to the art of it too, right? Storytelling, it's as much of a performance in doing it than what they're getting out. The spacing, the timing. Music is a great example. For people who are familiar with Eminem, he does something called syncopation, which is where by changing and stressing certain syllables and beats within a word or sentence, you can completely change how they sound and they rhyme. And he can make things rhyme that normally never would. There's a beautiful technique, and Travis is spot on. We're just using squiggles to try to recreate it, but it's a technique called Caesura, which goes back to poetry. And I believe because I've used it in the first binding, the technique is it's 2 horizontal dashes, and Shakespeare is really good at using it between certain lines, and it's a certain episodic pause. But you can actually use them between words to sort of elicit that same effect where you're changing how you pronounce them and the emphasis and timing, so you can try to mirror if someone was pronouncing it.
This always happens during edits for me. It's like you can pry my commas from my cold, dead hands. I know where that comma belongs. I know where that beat is.
The M dash. Oh God, I use
the
too
M
many of those,
dash.
but yes,
there's not an M dash button on the keyboard, and I think it's actually a crime.
There. Wait, is there not? Oh my God, now I'm like,
no, there's an M dash, but not an M.
You're right. Yeah, I just double click and then mine has a control for it. Actually, never mind. Yeah, my ducky.
I think there's a Control Alt that you can do, which I just figured out, and it's going to save me a lot of time.
Yes, yeah. Mine at least has the written over the N dash. I always forget that, but I was like, I thought there was. Like, I will buy a keyboard specifically to make sure it has the M dash, at least the symbol, so I remember that, because I use too many of them, much to my editor's dismay. The last question I have, and then we can maybe open it up to other people, is, and this gets a little personal, but it's kind of what stories mean to us. Are there any specific elements or techniques in storytelling that you find particularly exciting or that you enjoy incorporating into your work? Whether it's a trope, it can be something as simple as a style thing, like using an M dash, just anything that makes you really excited, like you think themes, whatever it is about storytelling that you just love incorporating, and maybe into all of your works or just some, or even if it's a particular project. Just something that's very you-based, I guess, with storytelling.
Something that I really love, and I think I originally picked up on it in A Song of Ice and Fire, was Tyrion was such a rich character because of his thoughts in italics. And it's something we see with Glokta in Joe Abercrombie's series. But I think that, it's so great to show a character's thoughts when we're looking at it from their perspective, because especially if you have a quieter character, you're not going to get the complete vision of who they are, because not everyone will say exactly what they feel, which I feel is very obvious to state. But giving someone's internal thoughts, their reactions that aren't said, can tell so much about a person.
I guess I'm not going to talk about a storytelling technique, but I'm going to talk about a reality of publication now, which is the fact that the stink of self-publishing has mostly evaporated, and that if you want to write a story and get it into people's hands and connect with other human beings with it, that's eminently possible now. That the cost to do so and the barriers to doing it have largely been eliminated. And I think that's incredibly powerful just for storytelling as a medium. I mean, just like any storytelling, you get great things, you get terrible things, you get weird things, but you just have so much more available, and there's so many more inroads that people can make into getting their words into other people's hands. It's kind of magic.
Wow. What works for
So
me
Jen
is
and I are
something.
making eyebrows at each other, daring each other to go first.
I'm gonna piggyback off something that Kaden brought up. It's something that I've noticed I like in a lot of my work, and this is definitely me projecting a little bit, I suppose, onto the page. But a lot of inner character philosophy, a lot of self-reflection, whether it's in first person or third, of characters having to reflect on choices that they've made or are going to have to make, or will affect other people. Because it's definitely been something prominent in my life. I grew up in a very, not to get into it here, but a very bad, hard situation familially, with systems of abuse and things like that. So I grew up really learning how to have to read people and prejudging all my actions. Is this going to cause backlash or danger to me or somebody else? So a lot of my characters always weigh that, or the opposite, and have to learn it the other way, because Ari grows up similarly in a very dangerous situation, and then also because of his cast in this particular series puts him at danger and levels of prejudice. And his reaction has always been being in survival mode. So he's immediately acting through the novels, and people sort of call him out on this, but therapy doesn't exist in the fantasy world. So he doesn't have the coping mechanisms or the awareness at first. And people are like, you're really clever. That's not the same thing as being wise. And the adult Ari constantly narrates past life parts of this in the frame and nesting stories. And you get the adult finally commenting on why he did certain things and realizing maybe that wasn't the best, but he didn't know better. And it's also a dialogue that way through the audience. But all of my characters do this, whether it's third person stories or not, some kind of interreflectiveness, because I think that's a natural, healthy way to go through life, is having that dialogue, because I guess I would be personally scared of people who don't ever self-reflect. And that's just kind of terrifying to me. And I think it's a way for me to get that out of myself, but also have that conversation with readers through characters and letting you get to see other sides of them, and either them changing or why they're refusing to change if they have the justification for whatever.
I think that one thing that will continue with my stories is that they are hopeful. They also can be dark. And that I've been thinking a lot about this, like, what does it mean to show the dark, and why do I do it? And I think it's because maybe it's just that, like, we see optimism as a naivete, or like, oh well, you're just ignorant, or oh, you haven't, you don't know any better, so you can't have that hope. And it's like, well, I think that really that optimism can be very powerful, and hope can be very powerful when you have gone through the crap and you have seen some dark stuff, but you still are going, and you still are holding on that it can get better. And that's something, those are the kinds of stories that I need right now. And that as a millennial, I think I just always will need. Um,
Our
so I think,
generational trauma.
all right. So I think that there's definitely that. And I also think that I'm going to continue to play around with the musicality of prose. writing a story. My current story has Orpheus vibes, and it's like how do you get music on the page? Because music is such a other dimensional thing, like it's otherworldly. And it's something that I connect to like super viscerally. So I try to put that lyricism and those rhythms, and I think I'm going to always be kind of experimenting with that and trying to see how I can mix these mediums.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to be the person giving like a really technical answer in a room full of heartfelt answers. I guess there's something I've been obsessed with, I guess, since writing Book Eaters and maybe before that, and I've talked about it with Ronnie a little bit, but it's this concept called the reader's journey, which is not a real term. It's just like a term that exists in my head. And it's this idea that for me, the book is something created, like, I'm going to start over with that. I became interested in the idea of like the book as an experience for the reader rather than a journey for my protagonist, if that makes sense. Like the protagonist does change and they do grow, but I was most interested in books, I find, as a reader, where my perception of what's going on, my thoughts on what I think I know about the characters is constantly shifting. And I think something like Last House on Needless Street or Where the Crawdads Sing or Gone Girl are books I think of that do that, which I enjoy, because you think you know what's going on, you think you know what the main character is like and what's happening, and every time you get a grip on that, everything changes. And I think what I love about that is that it creates a kind of complexity that for me reflects life. People are complicated. They're not straight good, they're not straight bad. Life is not really a story as much as we tell stories and want it to be. And the world is a very messy place, and I love the messiness of that experience and the complexity and the stickiness, and hopefully some readers do, and some of them very much don't.
Yeah, I guess at this point we can open up the questions if we have any, or that. I don't know. I did not do that, but that seems relevant from Zach Argyle. You should read Pure Nessie, I guess.
It's on my partner's bookshelf. It's very short. I need to get through the stack of arcs that I have to blurb, and I can read things that kind of already out.
I can definitely say I definitely enjoyed Pure Nessie. It definitely lives up to a lot of what you talked about. I always described it as I think I said this in our
Puzzle box.
Yeah, that, and also like either charmingly or like extremely British, which like kind of just sums it up. Like it's not descriptive, but it kind of is.
Yeah.
There's a lot of just very charming, quirky narration of people just being people, characters being characters, and interacting with things, and being very British about it. Like the idea of just having a conversation with like an inanimate object and just super sweet and wholesome about it, and his internal monologue of just like, I've been here many times and like this is the flooded corridor and blah 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 blah. He just rambles about it, but it's super charming. I could almost imagine Neil Gaiman just doing that, which kind of sums up being charmingly British, right? I'm not sure if we have any more comments coming into questions, or I can just close it out. But yeah, maybe I'll just give a minute or two for that. If anyone has anything last they want to close on, if we get a question, we'll answer. If not, this could be the end. Or awkward silence. I guess that's that's no.
Just
But yeah,
beatbox during this part.
yeah. No, but I mean that perfectly works. We had a few questions earlier on, so I guess thank you everyone for your time. Thank you everybody in the audience. This was absolutely wonderful. Oh yeah, no, this is definitely Adrian set all this up. I just got to ask and set this up. Oh, we actually
Thanks,
got
everybody.
one in last minute. Yeah. From Santosh Ganesh. What are your most favorite lines from your books? Wow, no pressure. I would remember that. I'm definitely not going first because I have to remember one of mine. Oh, mine's. I can't use that one. Shit.
Like I'm pulling my book up right now.
This, and now I can't remember.
What is the book? Did we write things? Holy shit.
I might actually cheat, open up my book too, because it's not out yet, but I can spoil the quote, but I really do like it. I'm not gonna lie. Let's see if I can find it though. I wrote many words in my defense, so I can find. Oh no, I can't spell. Oh, so I actually did find the quote, and it's one that personally means a lot to me, but it has it's talking about friendship. Let's get part of it, but it pretty much boils down that friendship is an unspoken agreement about the reciprocation of time, and time is an alternate way of spelling the word love, because we all choose who to give that with, who we choose to put it into and share our time with, whether we realize it or not. And it's a quiet way of seeing who and how we love people. Yeah, I know they the perfect brain buster at the last minute.
Oh man.
The one question that makes everyone bust out their phone or their ebook reader, like, oh,
Yeah,
crap.
like, oh gosh.
I can't even find it. I've got the book in front of me, and I'm like, wait, where did this go? What
Right.
did I write?
I'll try this one because it's short, I guess. And it's a conversation between Devon and a vicar who she meets in chapter 1. Because at the start of the book, you find Devon is hunting people for her son to consume because her son is a mind eater, and that means she has to pick good people. Otherwise, if he consumes bad people, he becomes a bad person, and that's obviously a big ethical for her. And she has this conversation where she always asks her victims, "Are you a good person?" And the vicar says, "None of us are truly good. All we can do is live by the light we are given." And Devon says, "Some of us don't have any light. How are we supposed to live then?" And then she throws him in the room and lets her son eat him. So there you go.
Wow. I
Alright,
got
I've
a
got
badass though.
I've got one, and it's even relevant to this podcast, so I'll use it. It's every book is a little mirror, and sometimes you look into it and see somebody else looking back.
Nice
That's
one.
beautiful.
Like I just tried looking around, but here's one that I really like. This is a character, just two characters are sitting in a carriage and one asks the other, "How are you? I don't want empty words. How is this all truly affecting you?" And I put that in there because so often I try to ask people like, "How are you?" But I don't want it to be like empty small talk. Like sometimes people just need an excuse to really talk how they really are. Like, how are they in life? What are their current emotions? And it's from there the scene kind of goes out to a big emotional spilling.
So I think that from First Bright Thing, my favorite line is, "You're not a monster, you've known monsters." For me, that was like a super healing line. And it's like kind of when you write a line and you're like, oh, that's what I'm doing in this book. Like you're like, oh, the book doesn't suck. There's like a core, there's an engine. Like, so it was one of those. And then I have a line from the book that I'm going to turn in after we get off the call. And this line might not actually make it. It's silly. It's a lot sillier. But the Reapers in my death book are dogs. They're guardians, and So this is from a journal entry. "You have gotten to know the dogs throughout the years. They were here before you. They will guide you. Respect them, honor them, give them these scritches they request."
You have to give doggos scriptures, right? Like unspoken law of the
I brought Gwen
universe.
to listen to your quote.
Yes.
Sorry.
Gonna demand scriptures now from you after this is all said and done. But yeah, if there's no more questions, wow. Thank you guys, everyone who turned out, and obviously thank you to all you wonderful authors for all your answers, your insights, and just making this like I learned so much, like Jesus, which is one of the best reasons I like doing this. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank everybody. Yeah, this is
Thank
great.
everyone.
Like, I love joining
All
in.
right, yeah, and I guess I'll just sign us out. Thank you for everybody watching.
Thanks all.
Thanks.